So on Sunday, I told you a lot of things about Michael, so I'm just going to repeat some of the highlights. That we're very excited at the Holocaust Centre that Michael has come here to be our keynote speaker for Kristallnacht. He's been helping Jane with and the team with a lot of work to do with the future museum that we're building. And he's so kind and generous with his time that he's agreed to come and do a seminar here that Jane and I actually heard part of this when we were in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem earlier in the year. So Michael is a writer, a lecturer, a teacher. He consults in the development of museums and historical film. He's the director of the Siggy Zierling Institute. He's professor of Jewish studies. He was also serving as president of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, which actually brought him to Australia way back in '99. He was the director, he worked at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, was there for the creation of it. He held the position of director of the Jewish Community Council of Greater Washington, opinion page editor, Washington Jewish Week, director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust. He was the one who wrote the report to the president. Which president was that, Michael? Carter, to Jimmy Carter. Yeah. He's also been working on the Illinois Holocaust Museum that just opened in Skokie, Chicago, the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. He's been working with museums in Cincinnati and Brooklyn and also across the globe, Belzec in Poland, the Tolerance Museum in Mexico City, and now he's working on a museum for Macedonian Jewry, also in Skopje in Macedonia. And that's not all, as I told you last time. He's authored or edited 22 books, hundreds of journalistic pieces, scores of scholarly articles. He's won awards for some of the films and documentaries he's been involved in, like The Last Days and One Survivor Remembers. He's been a consultant on conspiracy, uprising and defiance, and he's here today at the Holocaust Centre. So give him a warm Australian welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do two things with us. First of all, a very kind introduction. My mother might have believed it, but that's all right. I'm going to do two things with you today. I'm going to take you through, we're going to do a sort of a little bit of museum speak and talk about what museums do. I'll show some of my work and some of other people's work and take you through that. And then the second part, which is the part that I look forward to, is not hearing from me, but hearing from you, and we'll play it with everything you ever wanted to know about the Holocaust or museums, but we're afraid to ask. Okay, and we'll hold it as a dialogue. Let me give you a philosophy of museums, of historic museums in a particular way. My philosophy of historic museums is that museums are storytelling institutions. There are several modalities of storytelling. First of all, as Jews, you know that the Bible begins with the story of Genesis. And the first commentary on the Bible by Rashi says that if the Bible were if the Torah was a book of laws, it would begin in the 12th chapter of Exodus. Why does it begin with the Genesis story? Essentially, we tell stories. If you're a Christian, what are the Gospels if not the story of the life of Jesus? But story story was the oldest form of the transmission of history. And story in today's world, there are two modalities of telling stories. One is a novel and the other is film. Novel is private, film generally until the introduction of the DVD and now the stuff that comes over that you get over the internet. Film was a collective experience. And what is the difference between a museum and a film? Both tell a story. In a film, you have a captive audience and a moving imagery. Your choice in a film is to sit there and pay attention or to leave, and the director has you in his or her hand for the time you're there. Museum is a much more difficult thing because we have a moving audience, but captive imagery. And the story has to drive you to be able to do it. The second principle is a principle that we take from the Psalms. Psalms has a quote, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion." And you have to ask the question, why do we recite where we remember the destruction of Zion from? Because the place from which you remember an event shapes how you remember it. And place can be physical place can be place in time, place can be a whole range of things, and we are now in a very particular place as this museum is beginning to experience. We're moving from the generation that lived this history, for whom this was their personal story, and we are moving to a different generation that receives this as historical memory. Let me make it vivid to you in a very personal and cute way. I had a high school girlfriend whose mother was a survivor. And we've remained friends ever since. We always joke that had we met in college and not in high school, we probably would have married. I know her family, she knows my family, we get along very well. Nothing untoward ever occurs, and all of this. And she one day tells me the story. She says, you know, when you used to come to the house to pick me up, the most awkward time for a young boy picking up a girlfriend is when he has to spend time with her parents. He thinks he has his fly is unzipped, he's wearing two wrong socks, his tie doesn't match, and you want to get out of there as soon as possible. She said, you used to ask my mother to tell you her story, and she would tell you stuff that she wouldn't tell me, and my sister and I would wait at the top of the stairs and listen, and I would try to judge how long I could keep her talking before I ruined the evening for you. And in fact, we dated 6 months longer than we wanted to because I wanted to hear the end of the story. And I said, the place from which you remember an event shows how you remember it, because I could laugh now. Had she told me that when I was a senior in high school, I would have probably never dated a woman again. But the place, and place is very determinative, so you know in a very particular way that part of the museum story that you're telling is the story of Australia. Because you're remembering it from here, and even a humorous joke, which you'll probably be able to use in the museum, is a fellow was asked the question, where do you want to go? He said, I can get you a visa to Australia, but it's very far from here. And he said, I can think of no better recommendation. Place is very important, and place is also place in time. A museum must answer 4 very basic questions. But if you answer basic questions, you deepen the question, and that's the most important thing. But the question is very simple. What, where, with what, and how? Simple questions don't necessarily yield simple answers. Where are you building it? First of all, what do you want to say? What is your story? Once you decide what is your story, you have to grapple with where are you telling it? With what gives you a whole range of things. With what can be with what artifacts? With what narrative, with what audiovisual material, and now you can even have, for example, what virtual reality. And by the way, you're going to hear a word, which is that if you're going to use technology in a museum, my philosophy is technology must never be the purpose, it's the midwife. Meaning I never want somebody to ooh and ah about the technology. I want them to ooh and ah about what the technology allows them to experience. And there's a difference. If I went to the image of, to the motion picture moving imagery thing, I wanted to be wowed by the technology. Part of it is the evolution of technology itself and what technology enables you to do. That's not our story. So what do you have to say? Where are you saying it? And you must be relational to where you are, with what is all of the material, and then how, which is the combination of design, physicality, text, graphics, materiality. These are the very basic things, but asking a simple question does not necessarily yield a simple answer. This is my baby, mine and my colleagues, and I had a deal with them, which I've always maintained. I'm responsible for everything that's wrong, they're responsible for everything that's right. And that way that if you're not afraid to make a mistake, you can't work at the cutting edge of creativity. Because if you try something that's simple, you're just not there. So where we were was Washington, D.C., and what he created architecturally was a facade which looks like official Washington, but then takes you into a very different place. One side of the building was brick because the neighbor was brick, and one side of the building was limestone because the neighbor was limestone. That's where they make, it's called the Mint, it's where they make the dollars, and they never gave us free samples. But we would have loved to have it. Yad Vashem, again, for those of you who've been to Jerusalem, it's in Jerusalem Hills, and notice what they do, which is they cut the hill in half, and Yad Vashem then, and you can see a very interesting image of it here at the end, which is you see that the ending of the museum takes you to an overview of Jerusalem, which is bound by both sides. So you can't see Jerusalem that's industrial, you can't see Jerusalem that is fighting with each other, in which there's a struggle between multiple forms of Jews, yet alone Arabs. What you see is a pristine, beautiful forest, and Yad Vashem builds so that essentially they don't quite have to end, because the end is the state of Israel in all of its elements there. Auschwitz, you have to tell the story of Auschwitz. How many of you have been to Auschwitz? Well, I'm going to tell you something very interesting about Auschwitz as a museum, which is Auschwitz breaks, and I've said this at Auschwitz, so I can say it to you. Auschwitz breaks all of the rules of a museum, because what do you see in Auschwitz I? You see all the material that was gathered from Auschwitz II. The most powerful parts of Auschwitz I, the brick camp, is precisely what was gathered here. And therefore, what are you going to believe, what your lying, deceiving, conniving eyes are seeing, or what I tell you? And part of what they're not willing to rethink is how you grapple with the fact, and they also give you all the learning tools in Auschwitz I, and very limited learning tools in Auschwitz II. So, for example, they have the beautiful model of Stobiarsky of the crematoria, this powerful, powerful model of Stobiarsky of the crematoria in Auschwitz I. But where did it occur? Auschwitz II. They also introduced an interesting artifact to Auschwitz II, which took 4 or 5 years to look pretty good, given by an Australian, which is the railroad car. But the railroad car for the first couple of years was pretty. And no railroad car arrived in Birkenau what? That was pretty. They looked like hell. They smelled like hell. They were hell, and the like. This is New York City, and this is the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which overlooks the Statue of Liberty and consequently has to tell the story of immigration, and overlooks Ellis Island. And in my case of my family, if my family had not come into Ellis Island, I would have never been born. They probably would have been killed. So the idea of where you are and at the location overlooking Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, which used to say, what, give us your poor, your tired, those yearning to be free, the American story of welcoming immigration, which we used to have, became a very important story and had to be. And one of the flaws of New York City's museum is they didn't quite use it properly as part of its key. This is the memorial in Berlin. It's the Eisenman Memorial, and one could give a PhD in how to screw up a monument by the combination of the debate and what happened, and then how you redeem a monument, because if you've been to Berlin, the great achievement of this is not the monument. The great achievement is the learning center underneath the monument, which inch by inch, meter by meter, centimeter by centimeter, is one of the great memorials in the world, one of the great teaching tools in Berlin. But why do I say give a PhD? Because they understood. Let's start back and give it to you very, very quickly. The late Richard Holbrooke invited me to Germany as a guest of the American government, give a series of lectures on why Germany should build a Holocaust Museum. I helped build the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They said, we don't need a Holocaust Museum because we have authentic Holocaust sites. And I said, the difference between a site and a museum is a site tells the story of the site. A museum tells the total story, and you would have to tell the story about what it was like to be the nation of perpetrators. So they built a monument, and the model for the monument was like the Goldilocks story. I don't know if you have the Goldilocks story in Australia. Too hot, too cold, too big, too small. One was too large and one was too small. One was too powerful and one was not powerful enough. One was too sad and one was too happy. One was too depressing and one was too exhilarating. And consequently, they worked on a compromise, which is a series of coffins, but they play it safe because you can see the buildings around. And though it's a labyrinth, though it's a maze, you're always safe because you can somehow get out of it. The Learning Center at the bottom is in most admirable work, etc. Now, time at which you remember an event, it's not only place, but it's time. We are in transitional time. We are the last to live in the presence of survivors, but we live at a distance from the event. Let me give you a biblical story on this, which I think tells us one of my favorite biblical stories, which I understand differently because of the Shoah. You all know the story of Lot, his wife, and his daughters who flee Sodom. His wife, by tradition, turns around. She turns into a pillar of salt. His daughters go forward. They think their father is the last man on earth. They get him drunk. They seduce him. They have 2 children, which are the foundation of great nations. The Bible does something very interesting. The Torah does something very interesting. It doesn't condemn incest in that case, lest you are misperceived. It does condemn incest very strongly in all sorts of other cases, but not in that case. What is the story saying? I suggest from a post-Holocaust vantage point. From a post-Holocaust vantage point, it says when you are fleeing, if you look back too soon, you're paralyzed by grief. The pillar of salt are the tears. You're paralyzed by grief. You can't get forward. You have to get on with the very difficult, often very compromised business of rebuilding life. And there are extraordinary elements of that, and think of and increasingly in my own thought, I've taken to this a statistic. The greatest single birth rate in Europe right after the war were among Holocaust survivors. Germany didn't rebuild. France didn't rebuild in terms of numbers. Holocaust survivors had children. The response to death was life. Secondly, something else incredible, which was Jewish life. Because some people learn the lesson, and you see it in Poland today when you see all of the people who are only now discovering that they have Jewish ancestry. Some people discovered that Jewishness was dangerous. It was, in fact, lethal, and they didn't want to transmit it. Survivors, for the most part, not only transmitted it, they did something physical, which is they circumcised their sons in 1945 and 46 when they couldn't yet trust that the world of the Shoah was fully over. They doubled down on Jewish experience. Israel is one manifestation of that. The Jewishness of bringing up a new generation of Jews is also a second manifestation. So where we are, we're in lived memory and historical memory, and every one of the institutions is also telling the story of survivors who now become not a story of resilience, not a story of victimization, but a story of resilience and a story of transition from victim to witness. Who answer the question, what do you do with suffering, which is you transmit it, not to say I suffered, but to say because I suffered, let me tell you what I learned and how you can do and the world must do differently. One of the great characteristics of moral witness today. And in the words, we are no longer going to meet the witnesses, so we have to become the witnesses to the witnesses, and that becomes our task. Now, the late Elie Wiesel said, only those who were there will ever know, and those who were there can never tell. With all due respect to Wiesel, I accept the former, I reject the latter. Meaning that survivors who were there know something that I do not know, but I can learn. Because those who were there have a hell of a story that they can tell. We have to accept that there's something we'll never know, or that we know differently, we know things differently than the survivor. I use the word cold, it means I forgot to bring a sweater. I use the word hungry, means I should have had a little bit more for lunch. Survivors got cold, the victims at Auschwitz got cold in October, they got warm again in May. They ate in 1941 or 39 or 40 or 41, they ate again in 1945. And very often the first meal almost killed them. So part of what we have to understand is we have to understand and respect those who tell us what the experience was like. And they do something, and I'm going to use we just had a meeting with somebody who showed up with a novella of Jesus written by the Chassam Sofer. So I'm going to use a Jesus term that Jews don't feel very comfortable with using very often, but one of the things survivors are is the incarnation of the experience, the embodiment of the experience. And we have to believe that they can tell and we can hear and we can learn, but we have to have a certain modesty in what us non-survivors can do, which is there are certain things that will elude us, and perhaps that's proper. With the passing of a generation, certain types of things as experience should elude us. We were building in Washington. So we had to build in Washington in dialogue with the institutions of Washington. And we were in dialogue with the centers of power and the centers of majesty. And consequently, we told the story of the Holocaust particular to Washington, in which the perpetrator was not only the German people and the German government, but it was the institution of government and the power, and we were at the intersection of Museum Washington, governmental Washington, and the monuments to the greats. And we told the Holocaust as the story of what happens when the power of government is not restrained by certain ultimate values. The idea that people have innate values to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the separation of powers, the check and balances, all the American narrative. And by the way, today you have to tell the story of the Weimar era because democracy itself is being challenged. And people want to know is how did a democratic government fail, polarize, and yield to an authoritarian, ultimately a totalitarian government. This then became an artifact of special use in Washington, This is called the Hollerith Machine. It was the granddaddy of the computer. It was the card sorter. When I registered for college in the last century, they used a card sorter as the first way in which we registered. I now have more power here than America had when we launched the atomic bomb, or than my whole university had in a room full of computers in the last century when I was in college, and my kids can't believe that that's the reality. But the Hollerith Machine represents government has information. What they do with the information is all important. This was used to identify Jews, ultimately to take hold of their possession, to give you a census as to who would have to be deported. And now imagine if you wanted to confiscate the wealth of Jews immediately, you could do it with several clicks of the keyboard. If you had the knowledge of what? Who was Jewish, what were the Australian equivalent of our social security numbers, and all of that. This is an artifact that makes sense in Washington. In a way, it wouldn't make sense in other places, except if it were, as it were, a capital city. So everywhere they celebrated the power of government, human achievement in art, science, technology, and history, the monument to great and important people, life, and events. We had to tell an American story. And by the way, we keep saying one very important piece of nonsense. We say that the importance is education. Nonsense. At the Wannsee conference, 8 of the men around the table, 8 of the 15 men had doctorates. Depends what type of education. Education itself is not the solution. A certain type of moral education, value education, humane education, respect for dignity, etc. So we told the American story. Holocaust is what happens to the powers if they're not linked to constitutional government. Restraint on the power of government, checks and balances, a certain notion of inalienable rights. And we began backwards. We began, and you're going to begin a little bit backwards also. We began with the idea of liberation, because we had to make the transition between the National Mall and the Holocaust. We had to bring people back at that point 50 years in time and move them a continent away. It's now 75 years in time and a continent away. And how do we do that? We begin through American eyes. Not because America liberated all of the bad camps, the Soviet Union did, but because we had to make the transition that our audience needed to make with regard to that. This is the museum in Skokie, and we had a brilliant architect who didn't know the Holocaust sensitively. I won't mention his name. And what he did is to create a dark building and a light building and a void between them, an empty space between them. The problem is we know that the Holocaust is not only a story of light and darkness, but afterwards is not all light, and during is not all darkness. Things have shades. In the middle of the Shoah, there were noble people who had a great deal of light. And the story of the post-war world, I don't have to remind you, we're all ashamed to live in the world in which we contemporarily live in. The story of the post-war world is not all one of light. Consequently, we had to, as it were, sabotage the building to tell a more complex story. But you have very often people choose architects, especially because most of these are built by developers, who choose an architect and then get an anchor tenant. And they have a building, and if form follows function, you need to know what's going to go on in the museum before you decide what you're going to build in a museum, and only very seldom do we get that opportunity because of the way in which the reality goes. We had to tell the Skokie story. Why is it in Skokie? Because Skokie was a scene in 1977 where neo-Nazis wanted to march in a town that had 60,000 Jews, 25,000 Holocaust survivors. America has a tradition of freedom of speech. All the Jewish organization says, quarantine it, let it happen, it's freedom of speech, we can't fight it. And the survivors said, not in my home, not in my backyard. Skokie invaded but not conquered, which became, by the way, a call to action on the part of survivors who drove the Jewish community to be responsive and who said, not here, not in my home, not in my backyard, not in my place, not without consequences. And this was a sign of a tremendous tension between two fundamental values, freedom of expression and also the question of home. We did something which was an interesting transition, and everybody, and I gave a lecture at Yad Vashem, which Jane and Suzanne heard, on the desire of new generations to grapple with genocide, not only the Shoah. So here we were in a transitional mode between the survivors who were the founders and people who wanted to deal with genocide. And we dealt with it with a exhibition called The Legacy of Absence. This was artistic creations and physical creations that represented places where murder had been, but where the violence of genocide had already passed. If some of you have been, for example, to the Galicia Museum in Krakow, the Galicia Museum in Krakow shows you the sites of former destruction, which are no longer in the midst of destruction, but they show you what's the remnant that lasts, and we had a whole range of an exhibition called The Legacy of Absence. They're now trying a very super duper high duper 360-degree hologram with a survivor speaking, in which you can ask questions of the survivor, designed for the period of time which is unfortunately not too long in coming, in which you're no longer going to have a real survivor present. And the question we do not yet know, is this kitsch? And I'm not saying it is. Or is this authentic learning, and will the technology be able to solve the problem of transition? And I like to say, I always say I'm an agnostic, meaning I'm open to challenging the ideas and facing it, but Skokie has done this, and in fact some of the survivors it has interviewed already are survivors who are no longer introduced in 360 degrees and the like. This is our museum in Skokie, bad picture of it, in which we have to tell the story of the Jews of Macedonia. And the Jews of Macedonia are an interesting story. First of all, it has the oldest known synagogue outside of the land of Israel was in Macedonia, and we have a remnant of that. It is the synagogue and its remnant are there. Secondly, the story of Macedonian Jewry is the story of the Spanish Inquisition. People came from Spain via Italy up to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire invited Jews in precisely for the reasons that Spain was expelling them. Jews, ironically, brought with them the printing press steel, and they brought with them international trade because Jews were the original globalists. Because Jews could do business with other Jews all over the world, and we therefore could trade. And the other thing about the Macedonian story is that the Jews of Macedonia went through a 2-week ghetto at a place called Monopol. They did it under Bulgarian occupation, and then they were sent to Treblinka, and not one Jew who went to Treblinka returned. The Bulgarians then, after killing the Jews, permitting the Jews of Thrace and Macedonia to be killed, saved their own Jews as the civic society erupted, but only erupted after there had been the shedding of blood. So here we have, again, the centerpiece is occupation, ghettoization, monopol, deportation, and Treblinka. The exceptions were foreign nationals, doctors, and pharmacists, because you would have had no doctors or pharmacists. In Macedonia, Jews were 82% of the doctors and 79% of the pharmacists. The rescue story is more important because it's Albanian Muslims saving Jews. And they had a tradition called Besa. Resistance, our Jews are an integral part of resistance. Moshe Piadi was the number 2 man to Marshal Tito. Jews were an integral part. The Esther Ovadia Mara was a hero of the nation. Treblinka no returned, the rebirth legacy in a place where genocide has occurred again, and the traditional lessons cannot be applied, and you don't have a standard narrative to be told. We try a couple of images. This is a beautiful artistic representation of people holding up and asking for information about the dead. We leave some of these with a mirror in which you can see yourself, as if you were one of the dead, and some that are blank, because not even a picture remains. And you see in the aftermath, the same thing occurred in the aftermath in the United States of 9/11. Has anybody seen my person? And it's one of the ways in which we grapple with it. We use a model of Treblinka. You're going to be using a model of Treblinka. We then make it come alive with the testimony of the last witness of Treblinka, and also with a computer rendition that gives the model all sorts of very important life. We're going to share that with you. This is a new museum in Dallas that we're building that is coming. Yiddish het zegt in Kimtarois van Dreerd. It's coming out of the ground now, but Dreerd has a double meaning. And you'll see there are 2 wings. One is the Holocaust Wing, the other is the Human Rights Wing. The integration of that is the Holocaust Wing is followed by a combination of the Nuremberg trials and then the 2 attempts of the world to come to terms with the Holocaust, which is the combination of the Convention on Genocide and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that then becomes a pivot, and then we deal with genocide itself. But we deal with genocide itself. We deal with genocide itself in a very particular way. We use a pedagogical device that is superb, there's a man by the name of Greg Stanton who identified 10 stages of genocide. Culminating state of genocide become dehumanization, extermination, and then denial. But included in the beginning is discrimination, polarization, persecution, and a whole range of things. And what we do is we use each of these to illustrate one of the 10 major genocides, and we prefigure it by using it in the Holocaust, the same vocabulary, to be able to see how the Holocaust is the paradigm of that. So if, for example, dehumanization takes place, we quote Franz Steigl, who said, "Why did you kill the people if you're going to dehumanize them anyhow?" The answer is what? It made it easier. We show polarization we show, for example, categorization by the Nuremberg laws. A Jew is defined biologically based on the religion of their grandparents. And this was an example of something that you'll find a little bit interesting. The museum was an existing museum which wanted to expand its scope and mission, called itself now the Holocaust Museum and Human Rights Education Center. Organic development, coherence and flow, the Holocaust, we end the story with the Nuremberg trials, which are the first mention of genocide. And we ask the question of how do we rebuild in the aftermath of mass destruction? And we compare the I can compare it with the Skokie survivor rebuilding. We deal with the scaffolding of justice, maybe even the illusion of justice. And I could take you through this, and you see this is the Holocaust side. That becomes the return to life, the Nuremberg laws, the Genocide Convention, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then we have the genocide exhibition finally the return to life, finally the focus on America, and then the question of beyond tolerance theater, which is what do we do not with tolerance, what is it beyond tolerance, and all that is involved in it. We have themes of American ideals, American reality, and American repair. And part of what we're talking about is one of the things about a democracy is not a democracy is perfect. Obviously, it's human, it's imperfect, but it has the capacity to repair. We're now dealing with a less optimistic period of time where we see a democracy has the capacity to deteriorate rapidly and to destroy the social norms. And what we're asking our people to do is to embrace ideals, to challenge reality, and to participate in repair, and to see themselves as part of the solution. We're talking about beyond tolerance because there are certain things we shouldn't tolerate, but we have to have an expansive sense of it. And finally, it concludes with a call to action. The elements of the exhibition on genocide are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation. Let me just show you again. Preparation. The ghettos can be seen as a holding pen. When I teach the ghettos, I say the ghetto was the place in which Jews lived until. For the Germans, it was, in retrospect, until the infrastructure for the destruction of the Jews was created, and until the decision was made as to what to do with the Jews. For Jews, it was until what? Überleben, until the Germans come to their senses, until they're defeated, until the world comes to our rescue. We have to outlive it, but preparation is a preparation that the perpetrators take place. Symbolization in the Shoah is very simple. What is the symbol? The Jewish star. Why? Because Jewish identity cannot be seen externally. We always have the joke, you don't look Jewish. Jewish, it's not black skin, it's not Asiatic eyes. It's essentially, you don't look Jewish, and consequently that. And we've done a series of sculptures that represent it and tell it, and we'll also use the graphic novel as a means of doing it. Let me talk for one moment about memorialization and then conclude. This obviously is Treblinka. And notice what Treblinka does is to walk you through the experience. The tracks suggest what? Arrival. This is what the Nazis called the Himmelstrasse, the highway to heaven, the path to heaven, the gas chamber, and then this is where they burn the bodies. And finally, you have 17,000 individual stones, and the 17,000 individual stones are designed. If I don't wear my glasses and I see at a distance and I squint, they almost look like either cemetery stones or human figures of different sorts. As you look at it, only one has a name, which is Korchak, and the rest represent town and communities and whatever have you. And Treblinka does a brilliant job, an absolutely brilliant job of giving you the presence, the presence of absence. The Jews are there. I felt the first time I went there, I'm now among my people. They're all here. They all died here. All were murdered here. We did something else, which is we were called upon to build Belzhitz. So we said that we wanted not to talk about the victims, but to talk about the perpetrator. We could have chosen a victim-centered. We talked about the perpetrator. This essentially is a long path to a wall. Those of you who know the Song of the Sea, the sea becomes v'hamayim lahem choma miminam umismolam. The sea becomes a wall on their right and the left, but this is not a wall that becomes a wall to rescue. It's a wall to destruction. We took something of the Vietnam Wall, and the Vietnam Wall, which is very successful in America, gets higher and higher and higher as the war gets greater and greater. But the Vietnam Wall is on one side, you're safe because you can see out. Here you're not safe. You walk down a path, this is railroad tracks on indentation all the way through. You walk down and you come to a wall and it says, Eretz al Tchasiyat Tamam, Val Tehem Makom Zakatam. Earth do not what? Try to see it. Once. Earth do not cover their blood, and let there be no resting place for their outcry. Behind that, we have the first names of Jews who were killed, because for every Yatzik there were 1,000, and for every Shlomo there were 2,000, and for every Rachel and Rivka there were hundreds and thousands, etc., etc. And then as you walk around the camp, and remember what the camp looks like as you come in, as you walk around the camp, you see every deportation from all the villages and the cities and towns of Galicia, which is the people who were killed here, and you can see day by day, month by month, the nature of the deportations. We have a monument to the railroad car, and then the famous poem by Don Pagas of the railroad car. And this is a problematic one because it's a brilliant poem, but it actually didn't happen, and our visitor doesn't know that it didn't happen. But it says, written in a pencil in a sealed railway car, here in this carload I am Eve with Abel my son. If you see my other son Cain, son of man, tell him I. And that makes this murder the replication of the first murder and all that that implies. And notice it asks questions rather than give answers. The part that I'm also proud of is we do what they don't do well in Treblinka, which is if you arrive in Treblinka and you know the story, then the memorial speaks to you. At Belzhytz, we integrated a museum that tells the story of what happened at Belzhytz. So you don't have to know the story arriving, you can learn the story there and then visit the memorial. And I think increasingly for memorials, that's the important point to do, because people are not going to know the story innately. And consequently, when you create a memorial, you tell the story. We don't tell the whole story of the Holocaust, but we tell the story of what happened at Belzhytz. So we begin, as it were, with life before. You see the pictures there. You begin then with the attack on Poland, not with the build-up to Nazi Germany, because this was a Polish element. This is a new exhibition, which I won't take you through because of time. This is an exhibition we built in Spain, which is an exhibition on Auschwitz itself, the first time the Auschwitz Museum has done an exhibition outside of Auschwitz. They lent us a couple of hundred artifacts, and it's been so successful in Spain that it has drawn about 550,000 people to a country which has no innate connection to the Shoah, because Spain was not a perpetrator nation. It was a neutral nation, and we all know that neutrality is not quite neutral, but it's not like that its people went, and Auschwitz has that symbolic power. Okay, that's a little bit of I could go on and on with some more stuff, but I think I'd rather hear your questions and your comments, and let's talk. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am. And tell me your name, and just so I know who I'm...
Okay, so I'm Lisa, and on Monday when you were talking about the righteous, you made some interesting comments, and I just thought that you'd like to repeat that.
Yeah. I love what Yad Vashem did about honoring the righteous among the nations of the earth, but I have two problems with it. I've said it to Yad Vashem, so I can say it to you. I think aside from day school kids or church kids, nobody aspires to be righteous. We aspire to be decent. And I also think that most of the rescuers didn't see themselves as righteous, they saw themselves as decent. ordinary people who did extraordinary things, or ordinary people who did ordinary things in the most extraordinary of times. So part of that means is let's not make decency out of reach. Let's make it something that our kids can aspire to be, the word upstander and the like, and the ordinary became extraordinary. It's, to my mind, philosophically, Hannah Arendt made a great mistake many years ago when she spoke about the banality of evil. She made a philosophical mistake, which is unusual for a good philosopher, because the evil wasn't banal, the evil was demonic. The evildoer may have been an ordinary person. Here, the gesture of saving another human being is an ordinary gesture, not an extraordinary gesture. If I feed a 6-year-old kid, I'm not doing something extraordinary. I'm feeding a hungry child. But it's that type quality of decency that we need to make it not out of reach, but within the capacity of our audience. Second thing that my quarrel is, for many years Yad Vashem didn't recognize a second group of people, which were Jews who saved Jews. And the very important model is and let me give you a non-Holocaust example, which is I worked as an advisor to the Freedom Center in Cincinnati that celebrated the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was, Cincinnati's located on, for those of you who don't know American geography, it's located on the Ohio River. Kentucky, across the Ohio River, was a slave state. Ohio was a free state. Now we can celebrate all the whites who came to the rescue of blacks, or we can also indicate the courage that it took of blacks to pull together and to create an underground railroad that went to safety. So Jews saving Jews is the equivalent of blacks saving blacks, which is an important part of it. And also, I want minority people to recognize that they have a capacity to what? To help themselves. Think of it in our ancestry story. What did it take for a Jew to go out into the desert from Egypt? We saw, if you read the Bible account, the Torah's account, many times they wanted to go back. And they remembered Egypt as having what? Been a place where they were safe. Going out to the desert takes a lot of courage. So part of what I want to say is let's not make the rescue out of reach, and let's not ignore the role of Jews in saving each other. Yes, ma'am. Your name?
Eva. My name's Frida.
I'm going, Eva, we'll get everybody.
I just wanted to ask, I don't think it was just a matter of feeding a 6-year-old child. If you took a child into your home and risked the lives of your children, you went beyond decent, you went to a different level.
I agree. There were many different stages of people who rescued. My mother used to have a phrase that guests like fish. Guests are like fish. After 3 days, the best of them stink. And here you took people into your house and you took them in for 3 years. So, at the risk of your life, and I'm not sure what my capacity is. We have guests in our home escaping the California fires. We have 12 people sleeping in our home, but you know the great joy of it is I'm not there. My wife's not there. They got to manage for themselves. I wonder if at the end of it I'm going to have a kosher kitchen, but we'll worry about that. Meantime, we're saving people who have been made homeless by the fires. We're certainly the irony of it is that we both joked about it. One of the people we're saving is one of the wealthiest people in Los Angeles, but you know the fires didn't know the difference between wealth and poor. So he's in our home, and in fact we were able. They escaped in one car, and he has 4 people in his family. They're using our cars, and But we're not there to put up with it. I guarantee you it would have taken much more if we had to, feed and clothe and feed and launder and everything 12 people, and that's not forever. These people the heroism is really great. In the back.
Frida, I just want to go back to the four things that a museum has to address: the how, the where. Don't ask me the other. But
What, where, with what, and how.
what about? So that's what we want to tell, or that's what we have to tell. But what about? What do you want the viewer, the visitor, to go away with? What effect?
Oh, you are superb, terrific, and wonderful. There's a wonderful concept which is revelation is not only what I have to say, but what you're capable of hearing. And the audience changes. And they're looking for different things at different points. We now show a film on the rise of Nazism that was made 25 years ago. There are no comparisons between Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. None. But my audience sees the question of the rise of Nazism and authoritarianism differently now than they did a year and 2 years ago. And if I showed the same film in Hungary or in Poland, they would see it differently as well. Our audience, when we first created the museum, our audience wanted to hear the Anne Frank story. Then everybody came in wanting to hear the Oskar Schindler story. And then after the movie that dealt with, for example, the Belsky brothers, they wanted to hear the story of the Belsky brothers, and then they wanted to hear the story of Holocaust denial. After the movie Denial, people come in with different needs and different audiences and whatever have you. And you have, and this is a very important word in creating a museum, you don't have one audience, you have multiple audiences. People see it through different eyes at different times. And consequently, you have to communicate in such a way that you're expansive instead of restrictive, you're opening instead of closing, and that you have and by the way, the Shoah as an event raises all of these issues. I joked on on Sunday night. I don't think it was Monday night, but it could have been. I can't swear. That I dream someday of being irrelevant. But I'm old enough to know it's not going to happen in my lifetime. What would be the ideal ending for a Holocaust museum? This is how bloody stupid 20th century people were. We couldn't experience something like this in our world. We know better. Not the world I live in. Not even the world Australians live in, and you guys have a calmer universe than I experience. So consequently, the Shoah raises those issues. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karen. My question falls off this one. So we're dealing with many, many students who are just beginning to see things historically and to understand history. Do we dilute the power of the Holocaust if we try to make it relevant to their experience?
I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem, the interesting thing is that the students make it relevant to their experience. I don't think you dilute it. I think that essentially you're responsive to it, but the students see it through their eyes and they raise issues that you're not going to know. Let me give you an example from the United States. Thing I love to do more than anything else after I create a museum is to talk to the audiences after they've seen the museum. Never want to talk to an audience before they see a museum, and even when I do a film, I have a one-line introduction to a film. No bad film has been saved by a good introduction, And no good film needs an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, here's your film. But let's talk afterwards. I had a kid who said, I didn't know, I had a kid having visited the United States Holocaust Museum. He said, I didn't know the Jews were black. He'd only seen pictures of white guys. What did he mean? It took me a couple of seconds to understand that he always saw persecution in black. And he didn't know white guys could be persecuted. Interestingly enough, when, for example, in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or in Skokie, the police come through, they're much more interested in the top floor on the rise of Nazism when the police become the instrumentalities of oppression. And how do we not become the instrumentalities of oppression as police? You're not diluting the story by focusing on 33 through 39. You're telling one part of the story. If we had stopped it in 1937, 36, 35, 34, we would have never ended up needing the other parts of the whole thing. So I don't think you're doing that. I think you have to allow the students to make it relevant and also to save them from trivialization. You know, the fact that I was cold yesterday is not the same as what a survivor experienced in December wearing a pajama top. Yes, the gentleman behind her.
First of all, thank you very much, Michael. I'm very interested in the area of technology that you sort of alluded to in the presentation, specifically how we can do things outside of museums that through technology to complement what museums do. What is actually the role and how it can be used?
Okay. Let me start by saying I made a massive mistake in copyright release in 1990. We got a copyright release for use of material in the museum. Lo and behold, the internet is created, and you don't need use of material in the museum, you need use of material by the museum. Because you have visitors coming in all sorts of ways, those who enter your portals and those whose portals you enter. And, you know, we have, when we take out Torah, we say, Ki mitzion te'te Torah, out of Zion comes forth the Torah. Out of this comes forth education, and you have people who will never walk in here who can benefit from it. Some rules are experience of technology. Technology must be the midwife for information. This is not the place to ooh and ah about technology. It's to ooh and ah about what the technology allows you to experience. Second thing about it is I always suggest you create it the state-of-the-art -1. And the reason you created the state-of-the-art -1 is because you're not paying for the development of technology. My colleagues at the Shoah Foundation, in part drawing from Spielberg, want to create it the state-of-the-art +1, which is why everything costs 5 and 10 times as much as it will cost 5 or 3 years later, and in which time they have broken some barriers, but also had things that became, you know, enormous waste of time. You have to ask, what can you do with technology? But the other thing about technology, my college roommate is a psychiatrist in Silicon Valley. And he says he knows that his clients are ready to end treatment when they can go out to dinner and talk to the person at the table with them and not text them. And as he said, I no longer, you'll forgive me, but I'm quoting him, I no longer care who they have sex with as long as they're in the same room. He said, because his experience is the world is experienced in this. That's the nature of the world. Now, technology in museums, I was telling Jane the story of the Bible Museum. Bible Museum in Washington, D.C. has a phenomenal piece of technology that 5 years from today is going to be available in every museum. It takes you in, it asks you who you are, what you're interested in, and how much time you have. And then it charts a path for you by what you're interested in. I'm interested in the Hebrew Bible. I have an hour and 45 minutes and the like, and I'm interested in the prophets of ancient Israel. And it takes me through the museum to see the prophets of ancient Israel and not the New Testament, etc. And then it remembers who I am so that when I come back next time, it says, last time you saw this, what else would you like to see? Now that's fantastic. It's unbelievable. And those of you, for example, who have been to Poland, which is a large museum, understand that if you have 2 hours, they have a 5-hour trip for you. But most of you don't have 5 hours, and you're really not capable of standing on your feet for 5 hours and absorbing things for 5 hours. Consequently, technology can do many things, but our goal is to teach the history, and to teach the history in such a way that it both informs and moves. And by the way, also to reserve a little bit of combination of modesty and sanctity. This has to be sacred space, because the event itself is what I call, well, let me tell you this an interesting story. One of the great scholars of the Holocaust is a fellow named Robert Jan van Pelt, architectural historian, who wrote his PhD dissertation on the ancient temple in Jerusalem. His second member on his PhD committee asked him a question. In his PhD defense, he said, "What's the most holy site in the world today?" And he blurted out without knowing it, he said, "Auschwitz." And then he said, "Gee, if Auschwitz is the most holy site in the world today, it's actually the holy anti-holy. It's so evil that now it's awesome, and the like." He said, "I better learn something about Auschwitz, because I've just said something that may actually be, despite the fact that I said it, may actually be true." And consequently, you have to use technology wisely, you have to use it with seichel, and you have to also understand what it can and cannot do. And ultimately, you want people to see, to hear, to listen, to do a variety of things. And that's important. Yes, sir.
Daniel, conservation volunteer here at the center. Very interested in what you are doing in Dallas in terms of grounding the experience of the Holocaust in human rights and in genocides across the globe and throughout history. And I think especially as we move into a generation where we don't have survivors, that becomes even more important, is to make it current and to make it real, especially in a place like Australia, in a place like the U.S., in a place like Canada, where we are benefiting from the historical genocide on this land with the treatment of indigenous peoples. And I wondered if you could speak to how you see kind of maybe a place like D.C. and maybe a place like
Well, remember, let's begin. We created DC in 1993, which means the 1980s. And we had a problem in DC, which is we were being created by survivors. And we also were for a period of time, under the leadership of Elie Wiesel, who ironically was a Hungarian survivor, actually Romanian, but by the time he was deported, and for whom, when the Holocaust happened, it was only Jewish. 437,402 Jews were deported between the 15th of May and the 7th of July to Auschwitz. That included the Wiesel family, etc., etc., etc. Take Wiesenthal at the same time. Wiesenthal was in mixed camps, where Jews were not the only victims. And one of the things we had to wrestle with very early on is how do you include non-Jews without taking away from the uniqueness of the Jewish experience? So and then we also had to deal with the fact that there was tremendous political pressure, ironically by the Israelis, not to include Armenia in the discussion of genocide. So we took out and they made it a matter of the interest of state and the safety of the Jewish community in Turkey. By the way, all of which now, when Israel now has difficult relations with Turkey, what's the first thing Israel wants to proclaim is Turkey was genocidal. Having said that, we shied away from, and I lost my job the first time. I came back, but I lost my job the first time precisely because of the Armenian question. We didn't tackle it. It became politically too explosive. The Turks put pressure on the Israelis put pressure on the Americans put pressure on certain members of our leadership, and it was a bad thing. And I was young and stupid and thought I had to deal with historical truth and tell the truth to everybody, and therefore I ended up for a period of time unemployed, but there's life after unemployment. And in retrospect, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, but I wouldn't say it at the time. Having said that, we shied away from it, but now the museum itself has a center that is opposing genocide and is trying to find a way of doing it. Our idea in Dallas is to move organically. And the reason I say organically is because people come to visit one institution. They're not going to believe you if you have 4 different things, right? Some of you have been to the Schindler Museum in Krakow. Been to the Schindler Museum in Krakow, it does 7 things, and consequently it does nothing quite well. It does 7 different things very powerfully, but the mixture, too much. Talmud says, tafastim rubello, tafast, if you grab too much, you grab nothing at all. Consequently, we thought we could move organically from Holocaust to Nuremberg to genocide to Holocaust to Nuremberg to the Convention on Genocide to the Human Rights Declaration to genocide itself, and then focus it on America. And we're facing a lot of political realities in there because we're speaking to a Texas audience. Texas is what? A line of it's on the border. That's where they want to build the wall. Mexico's going to pay for it, obviously, but that's a different story. But having said it, we're finding that you have to grapple with this, and you also need courageous lay leadership who are willing to pay the price of facing up to telling a difficult story. When I led staffs, I always said, I'm responsible for anything bad, you guys take credit for everything good. Which means people don't have to shy away from pushing to create a sharp edge. Let's take some more questions. Yes?
Viv Parry, President of the Child Survivors here in Melbourne. Given that we understand that our camp survivors, our older survivors, are not going to be able to take part in further education within Holocaust museums, the child survivors are still authentic witnesses to a time and place in history. And I find it, on behalf of the child survivors, I find it very difficult to have that acknowledgement for child survivors per se in museums. Perhaps in Britain, the King Transport might have a high profile. It certainly doesn't have that exhibition space or profile here.
I'm gonna let me say one thing before you finish your question. I'll come back to you in a second. Child survivors had a terrible problem with adult survivors, and adult survivors said, "What do you remember? What can you know?" And therefore, in one sense, the vividness of a child's recollections were, as it were, almost denied their authenticity of it. Now, child survivors are also going to misremember in certain ways. By the way, everybody misremembers. Let me give you a personal example. I took my son back to the home in which I grew up in. And all of a sudden I hear and we knocked on the door. I have no claim on the home. My parents sold it many years ago. But this was a home I grew up in. It still had the brick where I once got a hatchet. I knocked off a brick and I showed him the half brick is still there and it's still got the thing. And it was very exciting for me to see the home I grew up in. All of a sudden I hear my son say, "Hey, Dad, you told me you grew up in with a big room. This room is tiny." And I put my hand on his mouth, and I said, "Wait a minute here. People live here, and they're proud of their home, and I don't want you to talk negatively about their home, which was my home, etc. But remember, when I was here, I was 8, 9, and 10 years old. This was very big. You misjudge things because of where you're at, but things are indelibly remembered. And part of what you had was that parents were also afraid that their kids were broken by child survivors, so if they were reunited with their kid, they wanted to pretend that the kid didn't remember anything. Now, our task now is to show a variety of things. To show, for example, Kindertransport is also a question of how can parents love their kids so much and understand their peril that they're willing to give them up? And for kids, they experience that sometimes as rescue, sometimes as abandonment. And even the reunion was not a perfect reunion because the kids had grown. You left a 9-year-old, she's now 16. You left a child, the child's been on their own for 7 years, and you're broken by what you've experienced. So we have to represent that. And we have to do that, and we have to be sensitive to the legitimate chip on the shoulder that children's survivors have because they had not been acknowledged. Their experience had not been acknowledged by their parents or by their other people. And we're dependent on you. You guys will be the last survivors.
And given that when compensation claim finally came through for child survivors worldwide, that there was acknowledged 90,000 child survivors worldwide made application, of which 70,000 were granted that compensation. I'm just constantly disappointed on behalf of child survivors that they seem to be overlooked or that their whole experience is diminished. Through the point of exhibitions, it's almost like an afterthought. And I think that's a huge shame, given that the people that are coming through the Holocaust museums on a regular basis are school children who better to relate to than another child's story.
And not only that, but any number of these people have suffered the same sort of immigration issues and also the same sort of, let me tell you a story. Years ago, I worked in a building that had a mom and pop luncheonette type of place on the bottom floor. And when my father came to visit, it was run by Koreans. When my father came to visit, he loved to go down there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And he would sit with a cup of coffee and linger for an hour. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And my father was not a patient man. Could be accused of many things. Patience was not his middle name. So what are you doing? He said, "I'm seeing this family. The parents barely speak English. Their kid comes home from school. He calls their suppliers. He orders their parts. He's speaking fluently unaccented English to the rest of the world, speaking fluently unaccented Korean to his parents. He's going to get an education. He's going to succeed dramatically. And I'm re-experiencing my experience with my parents when I came home from school." He said, "I don't see the Korean parents. I see my parents. Because what did I do when I came home from school? I handled suppliers and business things because I could speak English. I could correspond. My parents were literate, but in 3 other languages, none of them English." So part of what you have to understand is you have to understand that kids are experiencing immigration. They're also experiencing diminished power of their parents because their parents have been injured by their experience. They're experiencing the capacity they have to adjust in all sorts of ways. Your problem about how to display child survivors should be Jane's nightmare. Impose it on her. Say, how are you going to solve that problem? It's solvable. Impose it on Jane. And don't settle for anything less than a good solution. Yes, let's do the following. It's now 5:05. What I like to do as a wrap-up is do the following. Everybody asks their question. I will give you one comprehensive answer, and we will conclude as you want to conclude by about 5 o'clock. Okay, so I see a couple of hands up. Your hand is up, your hand is up, your hand is up, so I have 3. If somebody can give me a pen so I can write it down, so I remember the questions. And then if there are one more round after this, we'll do that as well, but let's I got a pen. Let me just I need a piece of paper too. You see how well prepared I am. All the way in the back, gentlemen. Yes, sir.
My name is Anthony. You mentioned you were agnostic about the hologram style in a museum. I'd just like to comment, I recently went to the museum in Manhattan, where I saw some young children asking questions. And I've never seen kids so attentive in any museum and so excited about getting answers. I just pass on that as an experience.
So I'll come back to that. Very good. Ma'am, your question.
I'm a child survivor, and the comment I want to make that the second generation overpowering the child survivors. It happens, I don't know, in our museum. I don't know how it happens in your museum or other museums in Washington. Do the child survivors have more say than in our museum?
Okay.
Mine is more comments than a question.
Your name first. Your name first.
Oh, sorry, Frida. First of all, just a short thing about Charlotte Delbo. When she described her experiences at Auschwitz, she started off by saying, when I speak of cold, it is not the cold you're speaking of. When I speak of hunger, it's not the hunger you're speaking of. So that's just a comment about Charlotte Delbo, and she carried on there.
And Primo Levi said it. I mean, it's quite well known.
The other thing I want to say about child survivors is that there's a book called The Green Parrot. It's non-fiction. It's the story about the child survivor, but it's a non-fictional one. A child was actually placed with a non-Jewish person who was willing to keep her. The woman looked after her very, very well until the end of the war. At the end of the war, she was rescued she was found by an uncle who had survived. And she spoke very, very badly about the people who had saved her. She said they were the people who agreed that she could leave her mummy. And she felt a tremendous resentment about that. Why did they agree? About 6 months later, after she'd been living with the uncle, she gave another testimony. And this time, spoke in glowing terms of the people with whom she
Let me answer all 3 questions. The hologram, you're giving positive evidence. I like to hear positive evidence. I also want to see what happens after 20 and 30 minutes and what people take home. And being agnostic means I'm not denying it and I'm not being sarcastic. I'm being open. I'm persuadable by evidence. It works, it doesn't work. It works for some people, it doesn't work for other people. I'm persuadable. I just want to see that, and I'm dealing with the fact that they're probably investing $5 or $6 million in this, different institutions. I want to see it educationally tested as we see whether this actually does the job. I'm not saying it can't do the job. I'm just, I tell a funny story theologically. The easiest affirmation I make about as a Jew is that the Messiah has not yet come. I believe in a perfect faith that the Messiah has not yet come. And I always joke that there was a job in the shtetl. The job in the shtetl was to wait at the gate of the shtetl for the Messiah to come. The work was steady, the future was well provided for. Pay wasn't good, but that's something else. So if this is the answer, I am ready to be persuaded, but I want to see evidence. Let's talk about child survivors in another way. We just had a horrific experience in America, which is the separation of children from their parents at the borders of the United States. A horrendous experience. Radically different than what happened during the Holocaust, but still separation of children is separation of children. Horrific, terrible, and I try to teach audiences, saying something is not the Holocaust is not saying that it's not awful. Saying there are various stages of awful. This is a different awful. The smartest of parents reunified with their children or aunts and uncles who adopted their children. Let me give you a couple of examples. One by name Anita Epstein was a child in Poland who was saved. And she was saved by a family that treated her very well. Her mother survived the war and came to get her. And she thought her mother was a stranger. She didn't recognize her, didn't know her. And then they did something very interesting, which is that the woman who was her adoptive mother went with her mother and stayed for a week. And left the first time for an hour, and the second time for 2 hours, and the third time for lunch, and the fourth time for 4 hours. Left for 2 days and came back, left for 4 days and came back, and gradually weaned her from that, which was again a way of making the transitions wise. There's a great leader of American Jewry who recently retired, Abe Foxman, who was head of ADL, one of the more famous Jews. His parents had to kidnap him. They had to kidnap him, and they not only had to kidnap him, but I'm dealing with the memoir of a very close friend of mine, who for 3 generations has been screwed by Jewish history. His father was one of the wealthiest men in Poland, a PhD and a lawyer, and the like, lost everything. He was a child survivor whose parents again kidnapped him, and then they tried to, as it were, push the Christianity out of him. Abe Foxman's family, ironically, went with him to church until they could wean him away from the Catholicism he had been raised with. This family did it much more brutally. He ended up in the 3rd generation. His wife was shot, fell down over her child in the Sinai incident with the Egyptian who shot a series of Jews about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So for 3 generations, his family has been traumatized by Jewish history. So people have different ways of relating to child survivors, different type of wisdom. And the 2nd generation, there are souls in the 2nd generation that have run away from the experience, and there are Joes in the 2nd generation who have embraced the experience. We have advised something else, which is to prepare a brief film of survivors telling their story, and then letting the 2nd generation answer the questions of the students, even sometimes letting the survivors answer the questions so they don't have to perform every day, and it's less emotionally taxing for them. And question and answer is still one of the best ways of learning. Any other questions? Let's take the last question is yours, ma'am.
Okay, my name's Mary Slade, and thank you for this brilliant lecture and Sunday night as well. I've been thinking about what you're saying about survivors. Here, this is a very personal, idiosyncratic museum, I think, set up by survivors with stories we cherish and we hold very dear. So, when I went to Hiroshima just recently, they had a separate room where it was a survivor testimony room. Clearly, the survivors of what happened are also in the same position here. They're dying now. But they had a testimony room. And I'm just wondering what rather than holograms or documentaries, these were moving history one-on-one. Every person's in front of a TV screen, not,
We had a problem, how do you end the Holocaust Museum in Washington? And the question of how you ended, and we failed a dozen times. You got to know how to begin, you got to know how to end. And finally, a lousy New York detective series told us what to do. New York detective series, if you were your age and you lived in New York, in America, you would have remembered it, but you would have not thought of it in 40 years. New York detective series was called The Naked City. Was a New York, and The Naked City has, everybody remembers one line from the movie. There are 8 million people in this naked city, 8 million stories. And therefore, what we tried to do was to use fragments of memory. Everybody telling a little bit about their story. And the cacophony of it turned out to be it was like a collage where it all comes together. Collage, works on clashing imagery, but a great collage brings all the clashing imagery together for a resounding whole. And that's what we did. We did it because some of the people, I can tell it, but don't quote me, and you're going to show it on television, you're recording it, so let's be careful. We did it because we had people who were pressing us they knew America likes happy endings. So they wanted Anne Frank, above all, I believe that man is good at heart. Holocaust may not be evidence of that, but that's a different story. I'm not sure that man is good of heart. There are good people. So we figured that if we told fragments of the story, we'd be able to tell the diversity of experience. Heroic and noble, ignoble and difficult, etc., etc., etc. And the best way to do it is to conclude, as it were, almost with the sense of the legacy. What does one generation want to transmit to the other? We were dealing this afternoon with interesting documents. Somebody came in with a series of documents. And last week, before my youngest kids have now turned to majority, so we had to redo our wills. And my wife and I are flying on the same planes, so we had to want to make sure our wills were up to date. And one of the important things that Jews used to do was to give not a bequeathing of property, but also a legacy. Write what they wanted their kids and their grandchildren to remember of them, what they wanted them to be, a living will to it. And part of the way in which you conclude, as it were, in a museum sometimes, is the living will of survivors. I went through this so that future generations could learn from it. I want to remember the past, and above all, I want to transform the future. First of all, let me conclude by thanking you for the work that you do, because no museum is good without its core of committed volunteers. Thank you.